Okay. Thanks for coming. My name is Meg Ecclestone. I'm a collections librarian at the University of Guelph. Do you both want to, do you want me to say your names for you?
I'm Sally Sachs from Carleton University.
I'm Alana Squark from Carleton University.
So we are here today to talk about frontline perspectives on new collections roles in times of organizational restructuring, which surprisingly is a very hot topic right now in the library world. We have a lot that we want to talk about, and we could continue to talk at you all day on this topic. So we're going to be speaking quickly and concisely, and this is what we want to cover today over the next 40 minutes. I'm going to start by introducing my institutional context at the University of Guelph. It's okay if you've never heard of that place. We get it. We're from Canada. And then I'm going to hand it over to Sally and Alana, who are going to discuss the Carleton University library context and the collection development transformation that they've been going through and are continuing to work through at their institution. And then I'm going to take back over to talk about the University of Guelph today and my own experience going from a liaison librarian to a dedicated collections librarian role and working in a functional team. So, as I mentioned, the University of Guelph is in Canada, in a city aptly named Guelph. We're in southern Ontario. That is my brutalist concrete bunker that I go to work at every day. We are what Canadians refer to as a comprehensive university, which just means we're middle-sized. We're in between sized. We've got a 26,000 FTE for our undergraduate student population and a 3,000 FTE for our graduate student population. So we have a lot of research-intensive activities happening on campus, but we focus a lot on undergraduate and graduate education as well. We are not a research institution because we don't have a med school and we don't have a law school. So we're sort of a medium-sized institution in southern Ontario. And I'm actually not here to talk about my experience of the library reorganization at the University of Guelph because I was a student when Guelph went through its library reorg. The University of Guelph undertook the change from a traditional liaison model to a functional team model back in 2009, which kind of places them at the earlier part of what has now become a very hot trend in libraries. So I'm up here because I'm new to this model. I've never worked in a functional team model before, but I have not had the great pleasure of enduring a reorg. Dodged that bullet for the last decade. But I talked with senior colleagues who did live through that reorg, and I'm happy to say it's like mostly good news. Nobody talks about it disparagingly, but they do talk about how back in 2009, you might recall the global financial meltdown. That was super fun, and it created major constraints around academic library budgets and everybody's budgets everywhere. So it was sort of a cataclysmic financial situation coupled with the broader kind of forces that were coming, like rising up at that time. So we were really starting to see the explosion of social media and digital applications in research, like digital scholarship was really starting to take hold, and the explosion in applications of digital technologies to education. And you might recall that that's when stuff really, like open access and scholarly communications issues really started to take hold in academic libraries with absolutely no increase to our library complement because of the tragic budget situation. And 10 years later, all of those things continue to be true. It's not as dire a financial situation, but Ontario has, like our province is all publicly funded higher ed. We don't have private universities like you do in the States. So we have a austerity government right now, so we are living those austerity budgets once again. And those were the conditions under which my library went from a liaison model to a functional team breakdown. And the model that they landed on was to take the various liaison roles. So this is like liaisons who had a small number of academic departments for whom they did all of the information literacy, research consultations, and collections development responsibilities, and broke out those positions across 4 functional teams. The collections and content team, which is the team I find myself on today, the information literacy team, the scholarly communications team, and the discovery and access team. And that is how we look today, 10 years later. So I'm going to hand it over to my Carleton colleagues who are going to talk about, they have actually lived a reorg, they're going to tell you all about it, and then I'm going to pick up on what our collections and content team looks like today and how we approach our work in a functional way.
Hi everyone, I'm Alana from Carleton University, and there's our building right there, and we are located in Ottawa in Ontario. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the reorg that we went through because it's very recent and it's very fresh for us. But I'll talk about the university a little bit first. Carleton is a mid-sized institution. We have just over 30,000 students, about 27,000 undergrads and 4,000 graduate students. So we only have one library that's serving the whole university. And our collections budget as it is about 7 million Canadian, and that's less than the national average for similar sized institutions. And until very recently, the library has operated under the traditional liaison model. So liaisons were located within the Reference Services Department, and they were responsible for many aspects of collection development and collection maintenance, and this was in addition to their duties of providing instruction and research support. Our monograph budget was broken down across 3 faculties, and that was the Arts and Social Sciences, Business, Legal and Public Affairs, and STEM. And then that budget was further broken down into smaller pots. So each liaison was responsible for their own small pot of money for the subject they were covering, and that meant that over 20 individuals were responsible for various slices of our monograph budget. Our electronic resources and serials budget was managed by the head of collections and acquisitions, but that was also with a lot of input from all of the various liaisons. So as we moved to a more e-preferred format, and in the wake of dealing with a decreasing monograph budget, we decided to forego our approval plan in favor of a DDA pilot. And so once our DDA pilot was complete, which basically just means we ran out of money, we didn't resume our approval plan and we didn't resume another DDA, and Sally will touch a little bit about that later, but we stuck at that point to firm ordering only. So in 2014, the library began its organizational review. And the head of the library struck the organizational review, and it was comprised of about 20 staff members, which were both librarians and professional services staff. So the university librarian chaired and organized the meetings, but he didn't take part in the actual assessment, and he didn't take part in the actual forming of the recommendations. So it was all library staff that formed those recommendations. So after an initial assessment and research phase, the review group broke out into subcommittees, and they looked at various different parts of public services. One of them was including collections. And they came up with a few key findings. And one of them was uneven spending from liaisons, and this is for various reasons, but it was often dependent on workload. So those who had a lot of teaching weren't able to spend out their budget, and then people who didn't have as much teaching or other types of various work, a lot of times they were often overspent at the year. Another one was gaps in collection development when liaisons were on sabbatical or extended leave. So often these positions are not filled, and they're instead babysat by another liaison. So at that point, they're doing their other work and they don't have the time to actually develop the collection for those subject areas because it's not actually their own subject area. And for example, you could have a whole year where no one actually spends in a certain subject area. Only 7 to 8% of our collections budget was spent on monograph acquisitions, yet 20 to 25 staff members were responsible for spending it. And so that's a lot of time and effort that's being spent on a small portion of the budget. We also had over 250 fund codes, and over 50 of them were devoted to our book budget. So despite having all these codes, it wasn't accurately reflecting what was being spent in different areas. And because things are so multidisciplinary, it was hard to put them in these neat little pots. And the last one was that there was no central oversight. So within our department, because no one was devoted completely to collections, it made certain parts of collection development difficult. So there was no process in place to plan and train and mentor new staff on collection development. And there wasn't enough interaction with our technical staff and knowing who to go to for what. There was also no oversight on larger projects like weeding or cancellation projects. So before these collections roles were in place, we had to do a cancellation project. And then trying to find consensus between 20 to 25 people was actually very difficult because everyone, of course, wants to protect what they are liaisons for. And so there was no one in place to really take the time to examine usage stats, pricing, overlap analysis, or have the authority to make these difficult decisions. So after the public services review, this was our original vision of what it would look like. So it envisioned a collections team that was working as a unit, and that would be comprised of both collections librarians and technical services staff, and they would be under the head of collection development and acquisitions. The collections librarians would be exclusively focused on collections work with no frontline service role, and they would be responsible for form ordering, Gobi profiles, renewal and new subscriptions, weeding, quality assurance reports, and some assessment as well. And also the funding codes would be collapsed and reduced. And because things rarely work out the way you plan, we ended up with a completely different model than our original vision. So this is our modified version, and I'm not sure if you can see that too well, but what we have is a hybrid model. So the collections developments are still embedded within the research support services department, and that was formerly named reference services, so we changed our name, but we stayed embedded within that department. We're now organized into teams, which are the Arts and Social Sciences team, the Business, Legal, and Public Affairs team, and the STEM team. So at the moment, we have one collections librarian for the Arts and Social Sciences team, which is myself, and one for Business, Legal, and Public Affairs, which is Sally. But we don't currently have someone in place for STEM, and it's making things a little bit difficult, but we're working on it, and hopefully we'll have a librarian in that role soon. So in addition to our collections roles, we also do perform our frontline service role. So we're still on the research help desk, and we still do chat shifts. And we also each serve as a liaison for a low demand subject area. And so while we're not working under the head of collections or the head of acquisitions, we have very close working relationships with them, and also close working relationships with the technical services and acquisitions team. So we've been in these roles for about a year now, and I'll pass it on to Sally, who will talk about the transition into these roles within the department.
So as Alana said, we started in these roles about a year ago in October of 2018. And one of the first things that we did was we developed a questionnaire that we could use to guide one-on-one interviews with the liaison librarians. So we wanted to get their thoughts on collection development in general and learn a little bit about how they had done it when they were responsible for that. Even though we don't collect for the STEM group, we did actually send the questionnaires to the STEM liaisons as well, just so we could get that broadest possible perspective and see what the three main collection areas had in common, but also what distinguished them from each other. So some of the topics that we discussed, we covered collection development strategies. So we wanted to know, how did the liaisons keep themselves informed of what was coming out. We do most of our selection through Gobi, so we are all signed up for slips and notifications. We wanted to know if that was the main way they were keeping up to date with what was coming out, or if they had other methods of doing that, things like book reviews or taking faculty requests. We asked them about their format and platform preferences. So even though our collection development policy says that we're an e-preferred institution, we have some departments that are still print reliant. So we have an industrial design program that uses print, architecture uses print, I think art history also uses print. So we want to make sure that we're still meeting the needs of those departments. We asked our liaisons about the DDA plan, what they liked and what they didn't like. So I came to Carleton at the end of 2017. I think the DDA program had been over for a year, and they were still talking about it and mostly not saying great things. So we really wanted to get their thoughts on that, because a lot of people assumed that a switch to a centralized model necessarily meant we were going to implement another DDA plan. So we wanted to sort of work around that. We asked them about how they used their funds. So if they were responsible for multiple little pots of money, we wanted to know if they were moving money from one pot to another, if they found themselves overspending in one area, underspending in another. And the other thing that we wanted to know about with the funds, because it was such a rigid structure, was how they treated interdisciplinary works, and did they feel like they had to confine their purchasing to stay within really traditional subject-specific books, or if they felt that sort of freedom to expand their area of focus. And then finally, we just wanted to know, what did they think worked well under the previous model, what didn't work so well, and what did they want from us going forward, and what were their concerns with the new model. So this is super text heavy. I'm sorry, there's 2 slides like this, but these are essentially excerpts from the interviews that I did with the liaisons and faculty of public affairs, but it's more or less representative of views across the board. So in terms of how they educated themselves about what was coming out, the Gobi profiles certainly helped a lot, but so did faculty requests. So that was usually the main source, I think, for people to learn about what was new and emerging, and also for keeping track of what faculty were interested in. As far as the DDA program went, some people expressed a lot of frustration that they had spent hours crafting this plan and really, thinking about it very carefully. And then once it was launched, they felt that the criteria they had come up with weren't consistently applied across the board. And so there were a lot of general things sneaking in. We ended up buying a lot more encyclopedias than we normally would. And we also ended up buying some really specialized items that probably only the person who triggered that purchase would ever have thought to consult. As far as the fund codes went, interdisciplinary works were a problem. People felt like they had to really stick to very sort of traditional material just to make sure that they were fully representing their faculty when they spent, because they're accountable for that money, and because they have to answer faculty requests throughout the year, they want to make sure, they want to hold back a little bit and make sure that they have money to answer requests when they come in. And that other aspect of funding that Alana mentioned, there was no oversight of spending. So we would get an Excel sheet once a month, and we still get this, from our acquisitions team. But if you're only spending $2,000 or $3,000 in your little fund code, it is very easy to spend that in a month. And especially if you're in Canada and you're trying to do an exchange rate, take into account taxes, it's just easy to overspend and, not really get the best ballpark figure. So that was a problem there. What did people like about the old model? People like doing collection development when they feel they have time for it. But a lot of people commented that workloads weren't balanced, or that some people were in very teaching-heavy subject areas, and they didn't have the time to dedicate to collections that they would like to. And that really speaks to the tension of having both a frontline service role and doing collections work, which really is kind of back-end library work. So a lot of people felt that, if you have somebody who's asking for your time, they need you to teach, they need you to consult with a student, whatever that case is, the back-end library work is always going to be put on hold. And that's how it came to be that people weren't fully collecting in their areas over time. One of the things they did like about doing collection development is that it's a sort of organic way of creating those relationships with faculty. So if faculty needed something, they knew to go to their liaison, and that always facilitates an exchange, and it's just good to have those organic relationships. Good way to keep in touch with them. And so what we've sort of been focusing on for this first phase of transformation really has to do with how we purchase books. So we haven't yet fully approached the serial side of things or the database side of things, but we did ask about that. And specifically, we have a policy for our serials budget that if you want to add something, you've got to take something away to make room for it. So we asked people, are you in the habit of looking for new serial subscriptions? Are you in the habit of assessing our current serial subscriptions or database subscriptions in order to make room for new things? And overwhelmingly, the answer was no. People just didn't have the time to do that kind of assessment work. And that sort of leads into the next point, which is what they were hoping to get from us, is that they wanted help with assessment. They wanted help with evaluation of big packages, seeing what we had in duplicate, and they also really wanted better weeding oversight, more accountability, clearer processes, because we've always treated weeding as a project. It always seems to be something that comes up last minute. Suddenly we need to make space for renovation or whatever it is. They just wanted it to be a steadier process and better integrated into the flow of collection maintenance. So the first stage of our transition really took place during the second half of our fiscal year. So we started in October, our fiscal year ends at the end of April, so that took us to April 2019. And for the remainder of that time, our liaisons retained full access to their Gobi profiles, so they still had the ability to select and ultimately order books for the collection and spend out their remaining pots of money. However, at that time, we changed how we handled purchase suggestions. So we do have a web form. That used to go to our department head, and she would forward it to the appropriate subject liaison, and we took over for that form. So we were receiving all the faculty purchase requests or student purchase requests, and then we would answer those, but we would CC the liaison so they knew what we were bringing in. What else did we do? Every year we have an annual spending freeze. So this is just something that happens at the end of fiscal. It usually lasts a month and a half. And during that time, any purchase requests that come in are sort of treated in a special way. So they always get sent to acquisition. They say, hey, I know it's end of fiscal and the freeze is on, but can we buy this? This person really needs it. And tech services would do some magic and the book would turn up. So instead of sending those requests directly to tech services, they would send them to us. And that really sort of made visible the idea that we would be the go-to people for collections requests. Now, we were also responsible for explaining the new fund structure, so collapsing or taking all those tiny little pots of money and putting them into one faculty-based fund code. We didn't design the funding structure, that was what acquisitions did, but we took responsibility for it. So again, we were sort of that go-to point for questions about how that new funding structure would work. And we also started a weeding project because we weren't feeling ambitious enough. So we are getting a new library system, which brings its own set of complications, but we really wanted to do some deduplication of print and electronic holdings. So we asked our liaisons to take a look at some of our perpetual access packages and see if they were comfortable getting rid of some of our long runs of older serials. So after the new fiscal year started, this past May, that's when we really changed the selection process. So now all purchase requests get funneled through Alana and I, and we send those up to acquisitions. And because we are working so closely with acquisitions now, it's a more efficient workflow. We know who to send those requests to get things in motion right away. We don't have to try and remember who's responsible for what. And we retain selection rights in Gobi, so we're the ones who will actually place selections in a cart for acquisitions to order. Our liaisons, however, have been switched to a read-only model, so they can still receive slips, they can still see what's coming in and what's coming out in their subject areas, but what they do instead is they'll select something and they'll put it in a shared folder that Alana and I will monitor. We'll actually apply all of the funding information and the financial coding, and then we'll send that through to acquisitions for them. And of course, the acquisitions team is also using that new fund structure. And so this has resulted in a change in communication between liaisons and tech services because now they're going through us and the tech services team have 2 relationships to manage as opposed to 20 to 25 relationships with each of the liaisons. So we are now the regular point of contact for the annual renewals lists, usage statistics, anything having to do with replacing lost or missing items, and weeding decisions. So we will record those and we will pass those along to our cataloging team as needed. So what have we seen? We've seen steadiness in spending. We're halfway through the year, we're halfway through our funds, and we're not seeing areas that are underspent or overspent. It's a little more consistent. And that's been really helpful for just, keeping on track with things, and nobody's really worried about us running out of money anymore. This new fund structure has made it a lot easier to deal with interdisciplinary work, so we're less afraid of buying something that doesn't fit neatly within a mold, but ultimately if it serves more than one department, that's a win for everybody. So we can just go ahead and get those. We haven't committed to a DDA or evidence-based acquisition program yet, but we will consider them, of course. And we just feel that we're better positioned to actually work with the plan going forward because we can monitor it more actively. We can keep better tabs on it, and we can fine-tune as we go. And the tech services team have really experienced a positive change. It's just a lot easier for them. They find that this new model is much more efficient. And we've also noticed that because we're much more aware of products sort of across the board, across subject areas, we're much better, more aware of trends in the publishing industry, which is really cool to see. And so looking ahead, we are scheduling interviews, follow-up interviews with each of the liaisons for January through March 2020. So we'll be sitting down and checking in and asking them what's going well, what's not going well. And just a couple of things, to keep in mind as we go forward. We are very conscious of the fact that our liaisons and our frontline workers are the face of the library, and we want to make sure that they don't feel like they're accountable for something that is a little bit less under their control. So if someone comes to them and is unhappy with the collections-related decision that we've made, we're ready to take the heat. And we're really committed to ongoing communication with our liaisons and just constantly checking in with them and making sure that this new model is making sense and actually making it easier for them to focus on those frontline areas of their work. And so that's the view from a year in, and now Meg is going to take us to a view 10 years out.
Okay. Yeah, so a lot of the stuff, like the challenges that Carleton was sort of experiencing that sort of precipitated their reorg, I kind of feel like I'm nodding my head a lot because I feel like I'm living proof that the reorg works, and that the way that we approach collections work can be a lot more kind of holistic and straightforward. So we don't have that hybrid model that Carleton has. As I mentioned, we have a functional team model with those 4 quadrant teams. This is the breakdown for my team, the collections and content team. So I'm a member of the collections librarians box. There are 3 collections librarians in total. So where many moons ago may have been a liaison for 3 academic departments, I now oversee all of the disciplines across the social sciences and the School of Business. So I am the collections librarian for that huge chunk of programs and disciplines. And there are 2 other collections librarians, one who oversees the sciences and another who oversees the arts and humanities. So a very tidy breakdown of the entire world of human knowledge, but it does obviously create kind of this explosion in terms of the breadth of disciplines that we're each responsible for, but of course we don't do any teaching. We have no service responsibilities whatsoever. I am literally never out in the commons interacting with students, which, pluses and minuses. And then my team consists of the e-resources team, the acquisitions team, the course reserves team, and the print management team. And this is a really elegant setup because what it means is that our group oversees the entire life cycle of a resource. This is the terms workflow. So this is the entire life cycle of an e-resource, but you can apply it to a print resource as well, or any collection of things that you are collecting. So this was developed in the UK. It starts, and it just maps out, for every new thing you bring into your collection, you'll have to investigate, acquire, implement, evaluate, review, and then cancel, renew, or subscribe. And all of those points in the resources workflow are spoken to within our own team. We all report to the same head. We all work in the same space. We're physically co-located to one another, and we talk to each other every single day. So rather than approaching my liaison work through a disciplinary lens, instead I'm approaching my collections work through a terms workflow, through an e-resource, through like a collections life cycle. And that allows us to approach the collections work through a much more holistic lens. So we're able to look at every aspect of the acquisitions, assessment, cancellation process from soup to nuts, rather than being a little more isolated as a liaison who might only have a small area of responsibility for specific monograph acquisitions, and then all of the big serials and journals, packages, decisions kind of happening out in the black ether of whoever coordinates your collections work. So besides having a more holistic view of collections work, or whatever, resources management, I've had several liaison roles, but this is my first role working in a functional team, and definitely my first role looking exclusively at collections. So as I mentioned, I don't have any teaching or service responsibilities anymore. And the main changes that I have found, and that my colleagues would probably echo, is that where liaisons have a lot more autonomy and feel probably a lot more beholden to their faculty and their students and the people in the departments that they serve, I actually don't have a lot of face-to-face interactions, definitely with my students or with my faculty. My view is now focused a lot more on my team. I'm much more accountable to my team. My work is much more intertwined with the members of my team. So I've lost some autonomy, sorry. But I've definitely gained a sense that we can, by virtue of getting rid of those other responsibilities, we can really focus on larger scale strategic collections initiatives, whether they're massive weeding projects, which we do, major collections assessment undertakings, which we do, like tearing the lid off of our approval plans, which we've done. So it gives, we're working more like together, either as a collections librarians trio or as a broader collections and content team to do those larger, more strategic, more proactive projects. I've worked at schools that have the little pots of money syndrome, like Carleton suffered. It's so painful. I have one fund code it's mine. It's just the Meg fund code, and there's a Paul and Helen fund code, and we don't quibble about whether a book is well, I don't argue with myself about whether a book is a sociology book or a political science book or a marketing book. I just buy it, and I put it under my fund code. So our fund code structure is super, super simplified, and we generate discipline-specific reporting in other ways that are not hinging on the fund codes in our approval plans or in our budget structures. And I also have my own approval plan. I have the Meg approval plan, where each collections librarian is able to autonomously manage and make decisions about their approval and slip profiles for themselves in Gobi. And we work very, very closely together, and of course we work with our YBP rep very closely. But at the end of the day, I know if I change a specific instruction somewhere in my approval plan, it's not gonna have this terrible downstream effect on everybody else. It's just me, it's just the Meg approval plan. So in that sense, I've gained a lot of autonomy in other ways and been given the leverage to kind of go much more in depth on the collection side by virtue of working in these functional teams. So that's not to say that all this is not without its challenges. I'm going to hand it back over to Sally to talk about some of the stuff we still have to figure out going forward. You can take it from there.
Does this actually work? Oh, good. Okay, I'm just going to stay here because it's really only one slide. We just wanted to wrap up. Well, it would be really nice if we could wrap up and say, this is the way forward. We figured out how to do it, but we didn't. We're still figuring it out. So there are some challenges just going ahead, for us at least, that we know we need to tackle. So the big thing is the assessment piece. What our liaisons are looking for from us are not just user statistics or usage statistics, but they want us to be able to interpret them. So especially anything that's non-counter compliant, you really sort of have to work some magic to make those numbers make sense. The other thing that we've really noticed, at least at our institution, is that we're very much siloed from our reserves and ILL departments. And of course, that's a really, useful method of seeing who's asking for what, and also if you're spotting any trends and things where there are gaps in the collections, and we're having to get those items through ILL. The other thing is, too, that it's really good to know what's being put on reserve for the classes, because that could inform collection development. So we do want to develop a more close working relationship with that team. And then on the other side as well, we do have a scholarly communications librarian who reports to yet another part of the library, and so we're very much separated from that. And I was recently at a conference where they were talking about open access and how do we support open access. And from the collection side, if we're going to do that, for example, reallocate some of those dollars we're putting into commercial subscriptions, we need closer contact with our scholarly communications librarian to understand what kind of open access products we can support. And finally, the weeding piece. So we've had one weeding project. It went very well, but as the liaisons pointed out, they really do want more consistency across the board in terms of how we do weeding. So we have yet to develop that process, and we'll be doing that in the coming months and years. So all that to say, we're going through change. It's hard, but not impossible. And we're really glad you came today, and thank you. And we'd be very interested in hearing if you have any questions or comments.
That's a great question, and it got cut from my presentation, so I'm glad you brought it up. So the question is, how do I, as a collections librarian who admittedly doesn't have a lot of face-to-face interaction with our actual users, communicate with other librarians? Like you said, when you said liaisons, you mean other library workers or faculty? Or whoever is actually yeah. Okay, yeah, so we don't have any liaisons per se. We have dedicated information literacy librarians, ScholComm librarians, and a smattering of different titles under the Discovery and Access team. However, like the IL team is the most obvious example where they have an obvious subject breakdown, like we do. There's more than 3 IL librarians, but there are dedicated IL librarians who do all of the library instruction for parts of the social sciences and business, which are my subject areas. So we have tried to set up what we are calling disciplinary clusters, and that is where library workers who have any contact with a particular faculty or department or subject area, get into a room and talk. And that's it. It's falling on its face right now, and I don't really know why, but I just book the meetings with people. Obviously, I don't book IL librarians in early fall, because I'm not a masochist, but anybody from our learning services specialists to our writing services. Oh, our data folks, like we have technicians who are specialists in providing services to for our various data products, and based on their disciplinary breakdowns, might work exclusively with people in my departments. We talk all the time. So it's that disciplinary clusters structure that we've attempted to set up in order to overcome the new set of silos we created by breaking out into functional teams. Now, the challenge is that, for example, our Skullcom team didn't take a disciplinary breakdown approach to, there's I don't know, 5 Skullcom librarians, but they have further functional breakdown. We have a research data management librarian. We have an OER librarian. We don't have a Skullcom librarian for the social sciences. So the question then becomes who do we communicate with in that department, and how, and where are our overlaps there? So it's an imperfect process, and for sure the functional teams just created new divisions. It didn't eradicate divisions altogether.
Is that a question for me? Certainly, I mean, the way we've approached our transformation is that we've essentially decided to deal with the print first because we feel like that's the most manageable. But yeah, we've been treating them quite separately from each other in this process. I don't really know how much else we can say about it.
I think, by virtue, so the way that our head of collections tends to deal with the big deals, the big journal packages, because those tend to get funneled up to our national consortium. So in a sense, those big deals represent 3/4 of our acquisitions budget. So when you're talking about digital resources, that it all gets hoovered up into those big publisher packages that our head of collections acts as our representative for those negotiations. So a lot of that work goes over my head, and it looks terrifying, so I'm more than happy to have my boss deal with that. But in terms of our work being broken out between print and there's no distinction. The distinction is how we handle it because of the complexities that arise from trying to move around a physical book versus a link, which is much easier. So we tend to be a little, at the collections librarians deal with both for sure, but by virtue of how, one-time only budgets operate, we have much more control over what are the one-time only funds, whereas the ongoing subscriptions and serials are much more expensive. There's a huge inflation on those collections, so that tends to move up the hierarchy in terms of who makes those decisions. And by virtue of having more control over the monograph budgets, it tends to overrepresent the print collection in our conversations and decision making and our working lives day to day.
Time for one last question. Yeah, I don't think it is.
What was the experience like collapsing fund codes? And then I'm going to piggyback on more. For those librarians who lost some of that faculty development in their role, what was that experience like for them? Was that a little bit traumatic? Did you go down easy?
You want to take that?
Yeah, sure, I'll take this. I'll take the second question about how it was for some librarians to lose that role. And we made sure that they didn't feel like they were losing that role. So I keep a very close contact with the liaisons in the arts and social sciences team. And I mean, there are a couple who, they never wanted to do collection development in the first place, so they're not concerned at all. And then I do have a few who are very concerned, and they've been working at this for 20 years, and they still want to feel involved. So for those particular people, I allow them to still be involved, and I talk to them, I let them make suggestions, and they seem, at this point in time anyway, it seems to be an okay process because they still feel like they're very much involved.
Just to elaborate a little bit more, we welcome and want suggestions from the liaisons because we recognize they have subject expertise. So if they're telling us that we need something from the collection, we'll take it seriously and we'll get it for them. It's, you know, in some instances, it's just a question of us putting the order through. It really isn't us sort of trying to take every aspect of that collection development work away from them. They still have some control. I think the bigger part is the fear that they might have to answer, again, for decisions that they're no longer making. And, you know, all we can do is repeatedly tell them we are more than ready to step in and explain the decisions that we've had to make if somebody is unhappy with the work. And that's about it. Yeah. Oh, with the fun code. Oh, the fun code. How was it collapsing? Sorry, I didn't speak to the fun code part. It's great. Yeah. It really, honestly, it just simplifies everything. I mean, having one fun code to pull from, we no longer just have to think really narrowly in terms of what we're getting, and we can provide information to the liaisons about what we're getting in different ways. So we used to provide the information by way of fun code. What did you order using your fun code, and what are those books? Now we're looking more at subjects. We're looking more at just subject headings, interdisciplinary subject headings, things like that, so that people can see, even if we're not spending from their fund code, we are actually supplying content for their subject areas through other areas because we're so interdisciplinary. So it's actually gone quite well. And I think we're actually really out of time, so I'm going to cut it off there. Thank you, everybody.